This is the story of how the requirement to defend the Thames estuary in the early part of World War II resulted in two unique designs of fortification, which were themselves to influence the outcome of the war and the post-war North Sea oil exploration period. The man responsible for the designs was Guy Maunsells, an architect who was to earn the title of an eccentric as the result of a novel design he submitted to the Admiralty in 1939. This design, known as the Submersible observation post, was shaped like a bottle and was to be placed in the sea at regular intervals some 10 miles off the UK coastline. It was to be constructed of reinforced concrete and steel and weigh some 160 tons. It was 68 foot tall and 13 foot in diameter and had a crew of 5 men, one of whom was required to be on duty in the crow's nest at all times. The crew were to report by radio to the shore any detected movements of enemy shipping, aircraft or submarines. In the event of being attacked, the vessel was capable of submerging for up to 5 hours before resurfacing. These submersible observation posts were estimated to cost £150,000 each at 1995 prices, but were never built. Although the Admiralty viewed the idea with suspicion and considered Maunsell an eccentric, it should be borne in mind that at this early stage of the war, radar was in its infancy and still highly secret. What Maunsell was offering was a crude early warning system that would have worked and was low cost. In early 1940, a Commander Shankland, the Port of London Authority harbour master, based at Tilbury and responsible for the Thames estuary, asked the government to take some positive action to combat enemy activity in this area of operation. This activity consisted mainly of aerial mining of the sea lanes, with the consequence that shipping losses increased alarmingly. Commander Shankland was introduced to Maunsell through various intermediaries, and after some discussion, Maunsell submitted to the Admiralty in October 1940 his ideas in the shape of the Marine Fort No. 4 or the Martello Tower design. This design of fort, which was to house two 4.5-inch guns, was to be sunk in 15 fathoms of water at 3 strategic points, each 6 miles apart, across the Thames estuary between Margate in Kent and Clacton-on-Sea in Essex. The design was unusual inasmuch that it used a pontoon base which enabled the fort to be built on the shore and towed out to the required site before being sunk in situ. Maunsell estimated that these 3 forts would cost £4,250,000 at 1995 prices and take 6 months to build. The proposed crew was 50 officers and men. However, the Admiralty were not convinced that this idea would work in 90-foot deep water and asked Maunsell to think again. As a consequence, and following further talks with the Admiralty, he submitted in November 1940 a new design designated the Admiralty 10-fathom fort. This new proposal not only included the design of the fort, but also concise details of how it should be constructed, including the site layout and method of construction stage by stage. The Admiralty stated that 5 forts would be required to cover the Thames estuary, and Maunsell estimated that each would cost £1.5 million at 1995 prices. It was indicated that it would take 4.5 months for the first fort to be placed in position, with subsequent forts following at 5-week intervals. Although Maunsell persevered with the idea of the fort being built on shore mounted on a pontoon, the resultant design was to incorporate twin pontoons and twin towers, atop of which was a gun platform and other amenities. The crew of 50 men were to be accommodated in the 5 floors of each of the twin towers. The Admiralty again took no action with this proposal, continually raising questions and objections which Maunsell quickly dispelled as they were raised. It was not until Maunsell and his friend Sir Alexander Gibb approached the First Sea Lord, Admiral Fraser direct, at the Admiralty in London, that the civil engineer-in-chief of the Admiralty in Bath was persuaded to act in March 1941 and to place a contract. Following this decision, a site on the banks of the River Thames at Gravesend, the Red Lion Wharf site, was chosen and a contractor, Holloway Brothers Limited, appointed to carry out the construction work on yet a further modified fort design. This design consisted of a single pontoon with twin towers, each having 5 floors. The requirement was to be subsequently modified to 7 floors to house the increased crew complement of 100 men. The number of forts to be built was also reduced from 5 to 4. The Admiralty was still not convinced that the idea of sinking a huge concrete structure onto an unprepared seabed would work, and told Maunsell so. In reply, Maunsell, with the cooperation of the well-respected naval architect Mr. Lindsay, MINA, submitted a design paper showing exactly how the grounding would take place. He also produced a scale model with which he demonstrated the technique. The Admiralty listened to his explanation but reserved judgment. When work commenced in clearing the site in June 1941, some 100 men were engaged on the task. One of the first requirements was to construct a cofferdam with a removable dam gate open to the river. Whilst the site was being cleared and the cofferdam constructed, work also commenced on preparing in advance the steel reinforcing for the pontoon bases, this work being undertaken by men subcontracted from a local firm, the Gravesend Welding and Engineering Company. Once the cofferdam was constructed, work commenced inside the cofferdam in August 1941 on the construction of the first reinforced concrete pontoon base, which measured 168 foot long and 88 foot wide, with walls 14 foot high. Each pontoon weighed an estimated 2,000 tons on completion. When the pontoon base was finished, it was floated out of the cofferdam to a prepared berth on the foreshore, where the 24-foot diameter reinforced concrete towers were added in stages. First, the inner and outer shutters were placed in position, the reinforcing introduced, and the concrete poured. The inner wooden shuttering was left in situ for insulation. The precast floor section biscuits were built in advance and added after each lift, immediately before positioning the next set of shuttering. All machinery required to be placed in each tower leg had to be installed as the building progressed, due to the restricted access after construction. Unfortunately, the Admiralty introduced numerous changes, including the type of radar to be installed, the power generator requirement, and increased crew accommodation to man the radar. This led to delays in building the superstructure, which could not be added until the towers were 60 foot above the pontoon deck, with the result that some 5 weeks of working time were lost. By the 16th of December 1941, all 3 building berths were occupied with 3 naval forts in various stages of construction. As the Admiralty were anxious to get the first fort in position as soon as possible, men fitting the internal wiring, air conditioning and electrical equipment were diverted from forts 2 and 3 to concentrate in completing fort number 1. In fact, the internal and external painting was so far behind schedule that it was not completed until after the first fort had been towed to Tilbury. As a result of the various delays, the first fort was not ready to be towed from Gravesend across to berth 28 at Tilbury Docks until January the 1st, 1942. Here, the final stores loading and finishing touches to the various services were added, before the fort was degaussed prior to being towed downriver. You will note at this stage there is no dolphin fitted to the fort. No one had considered the question of resupply, and as an afterthought the dolphin was hastily constructed in 7 days by the Gravesend Welding and Engineering Company and placed in situ on the fort. Subsequent construction incorporated a slightly different design of dolphin. Fort number 1, named H.M. Fort Ruff's Tower, was not towed down river until February the 9th, 1942, due to a combination of bad weather and incorrect tides. It was towed down river by the tugs Crested Cock, Dapper, King Lear and the Lady Brassey. A series of catastrophes occurred en route, with the fort colliding with no less than 3 buoys, a lightship and the Thames boom. The following day, Tuesday, February the 10th, 1942, the convoy started off from Chapman's light buoy, where it had anchored overnight, and proceeded towards its chosen position for sinking. Unfortunately, the tow ropes broke, and the tow was restarted with the fort being towed crabwise for the rest of the journey. Overnight, the wind and swell worsened, with the result that a considerable amount of water entered the pontoon. This was pumped out, and the fort finally arrived at the grounding site at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, the 11th of February 1942. This view shows the fort partway through the grounding operation at 4:42 p.m. on the 11th of February 1942. And this view shows the fort in position in 37 feet of water at 4:45 p.m., just 3 minutes later. What happened during those few minutes is best described by watching the following film clip taken at the time. The Admiralty were in charge of this first grounding, and the officer in charge gave the order for the flooding valves to be opened too early. In order to stop water entering the pontoon during the tow-down river, a 4-foot-high wooden fence was erected around the top of the pontoon wall. This was to be removed prior to opening the flooding valves, and transported back to the building yard for use with the second fort sinking. Unfortunately, the port side fencing was still in place when the order was given, and as a result, the water entered the pontoon unevenly. Instead of sinking straight to the seabed by the nose as planned, the fort heeled over to starboard and grounded on the starboard forequarter at a transverse angle of about 30 degrees. There were approximately 120 people on board during this sinking, and when the Admiralty saw the film, they immediately decided that future sinkings should take place without naval personnel on board and be totally under the control of the contractor. The lessons learned from the first sinking were put to good use in the second fort sinking, that of HM Fort Sunk Head Tower. Firstly, a concrete buffer was placed in position on the prow of the pontoon during the tow, which was lowered over the bow to be crushed when the pontoon hit the seabed. This put paid to the Admiralty fears that the pontoon would break up on hitting the seabed due to impact stresses. HM Fort Sunkhead Tower was towed downriver on the 1st of June 1942 and grounded at about 10:30 at night. The whole grounding operation went smoothly, with only 50 seconds separating the first downward plunge and the settling movement. The fort was sunk in 43 feet of water. The third fort, HM Fort Tongue Sands, was taken downriver on the 27th of June 1942 and sunk in position at 8:52 p.m. From the time that the valves were opened, the fort took 14 minutes to sink to an upright position in 36 feet of water. The fourth fort, HM Fort Knock John, was towed downriver on August the 1st, 1942, leaving Tilbury at 5:40 in the early morning. It arrived at the grounding site at 1 p.m, but had to await the arrival of the naval ship HMS Campbell, which had on board the First Sea Lord, Admiral Fraser, Lord Louis Mountbatten, and General Pyle, who were to act as observers. With the arrival of the ship at 3 p.m, the order was relayed for the pontoon flood valves to be opened, and this action was taken at 3:32 p.m. It took 14 minutes for the fort to be grounded in 40 feet of water. Again, by good fortune, a cinefilm taken of the Knock John sinking at the time has survived, and this illustrates how a correct sinking should take place. As a result of watching the Knock John sinking, Lord Louis Mountbatten, on returning to the shore, flew directly to the Cairo Conference of Allied military leaders in Egypt. There he gave inspiration and confidence to the Allied plan to use a reinforced concrete artificial harbour for the invasion of Europe. Ultimately known as the Mulberry Harbour used in Normandy, this invention certainly gave the Allies the edge which the Germans had not been expecting. With his naval sea fort design, Maunsell had proved that it was possible to sink a large reinforced concrete structure onto an unprepared seabed. The four naval sea forts were positioned in the Thames estuary as shown. The two northerly forts were resupplied from Harwich, and their crews were shore-based at HMS Badger at Parkeston Quay, when not on the forts. The two southerly forts were resupplied from Sheerness and were shore-based at HMS Wildfire. Shortly after completing the second naval fort, Maunsell submitted to the Admiralty a new fort design which he had prepared to accommodate a heavy anti-aircraft gun battery. This design was to be used for deployment in the Liverpool Bay area, where it was proposed to site 38 such towers. A decision was also made to place 49 of these towers in the Thames estuary and 13 in the Humber estuary. Work on the Liverpool Bay towers started in March 1942 and was curtailed at 21 towers built due to a cutback in requirements notified to the contractor, the Cleveland Bridge and Engineering Company Limited, in January 1943. Similar reductions were made affecting the Thames estuary requirement, which was reduced to 21 towers, and also the Humber estuary, which was cancelled altogether. The construction site at Gravesend was modified to accommodate the new Army fort design, and new steel cofferdam gates were installed. The reinforced concrete bases, which took the shape of an Oxford picture frame, were built two at a time in the cofferdam. They measured 85 feet across and were approximately 6 foot by 5 feet in section. On completion, they were floated out at high tide to prepared pedestal berths situated on the foreshore. Here the reinforced concrete leg sections, which had been precast in advance, were added to the base in increments until the required height of 70 feet was reached. At this stage, a concrete cap was added, on top of which a steel superstructure was built. This consisted of a steel house 36 feet square and approximately 20 feet deep. In this structure, divided into two floors, were housed the equipment and crew accommodation. Depending on its function, the top floor or roof had either a 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun mounted, or a pair of 40mm Bofors guns, radar or a searchlight. There were 7 towers to a complete fort, comprising 4 with 3.7-inch guns, 1 with 2 Bofors guns, 1 with radar, and 1 with a searchlight. Once positioned, each tower was interconnected by a steel catwalk with wooden flooring. For towing downriver to their grounding sites, it was necessary to position each tower to the underside of 2 barges, which were known as camels. In the case of the Thames forts, 2 local barges, named Gold and Silver, were modified by inserting an extra 20-foot section. Once in position, the 2 barges were slowly towed by 3 or 4 tugs to their sites. On reaching the site, previously surveyed by the Admiralty hydrographer, the tower was winched down by hand onto the sea bed. This procedure taking quite some time, as accuracy was essential. The Bofors tower was always the first tower to be positioned in any group, as it offered immediate defence against any attacking enemy aircraft. The set of 7 towers were placed in a particular pattern as shown in the drawing, and the 3 sets of towers placed in the Thames estuary were situated at the Nore, Red Sands and Shivering Sands as depicted on the map. The Nore towers were positioned over the period May the 20th to July the 4th, 1943. The Red Sands over the period July the 23rd to September the 3rd, 1943, and Shivering Sands over the period September the 18th to December the 13th, 1943. During their wartime service, all of the towers combined were responsible for destroying 22 aircraft and 30 V-1 flying bombs or doodlebugs. With the war ending in 1945, both the naval and army forts were put on care and maintenance, and they remained in this state until abandoned by the government in 1956. There was a disaster on March the 1st, 1953, when a Swedish ship, the Baalbek, crashed into the Nore towers, knocking over a gun tower and the Bofors tower, killing 4 civilian caretakers. The Admiralty subsequently ordered the removal of this wreckage and the remaining towers in 1959-60, and they were dismantled and sold for scrap. The concrete leg sections were blown off just above the base, and the bases were uplifted and towed to Alpha Wharf Cliff, where they remain and can be seen to this day. This operation, carried out by the Port of London Authority, cost the enormous sum of £8 million at 1995 prices. On June the 7th, 1963, a ship named the Ribersborg ran into the Shivering Sands and knocked over a gun tower. No one was hurt, but the fort was left in a dilapidated state. During the period from 1964 to 1967, all of the forts were occupied by various radio pirate stations until the action by the government of introducing new legislation made the situation untenable and they were evacuated. With the exception of the Sunk Head Naval Fort, which was blown up by the Royal Engineers in August 1967, and the Nore forts removed in 1959-60, all of the other Maunsell Sea Forts built in the war still exist. Ruff's Towers was occupied in 1967 by Roy Bates, who claimed the fort as the independent state of Sealand. Despite the difficulties and cost of resupply from Holland, there is a question of the legality of supplying the fort from the UK, Roy Bates has retained ownership to this day, selling Sealand postage stamps and Sealand currency to collectors. Today, the forts remain defiant in the estuary. All of the interconnecting catwalks were destroyed by the Admiralty in the early 1970s and all of the armament removed between 1956 and June 1992, when the Tongue Sands and Knock John forts finally gave up their 3.7-inch guns to land-based museums. The final few minutes of this video show the forts as they were in August 1995. They appear in this order: Red Sands, Shivering Sands, Knock John and Tongue Sands. The total cost of the Maunsell Sea Fort programme, including the 21 towers in Liverpool Bay, amounted to the staggering sum of £44,385,280 at 1995 prices. Add to this the cost of removing the Nore towers in 1959-60 and the Mersey towers removed in 1948, and the resultant figure is nearer £60 million. My name is Frank Turner and I am the producer of this video, which I hope you have enjoyed. I have over the past 2 years carefully researched the history of the Maunsell Sea Forts, which has culminated in my writing of 2 full-length books: The Maunsell Sea Forts Part 1, the World War II Naval Sea Forts of the Thames Estuary, and the Maunsell Sea Forts Part 2, the World War II Army Sea Forts of the Thames and Mersey estuaries. In addition, there are a number of small A5 booklets describing previously classified secret projects that Guy Maunsells submitted to the government during the war. If you would like further particulars of any of these publications, why not contact me?